here is the Minolta 500 SI, and this was the very first film camera that I ever owned. Well, when I say very first film camera, this is in fact the fourth Minolta 500 SI that I've ever had. Now, I believe this should be your very first film camera or something similar, so let's talk about it. There are all these cameras out there, Leicas, Canon and Nikon F1s, all these rangefinders that look really cool, but a lot of them don't have the features of this. This camera here has all the features that those don't. It has multi-metering, multiple exposure modes, it has aperture priority, shutter priority, and being able to complete shoot manual mode, as well as a bunch of other specialty modes for different things such as shooting portraits or shooting sports. This camera is literally 1/10 of the price of those with more features. So if this camera here is cheaper than the Leicas and the Canons, why do less people want to buy it? And well, I kind of have an answer for that. They're just not as sexy. When you look at a Canon F1 or one of these older rangefinders, they're metallic. The thought and design of them looks different to modern cameras, whereas if you look at the Minolta, it's not that too dissimilar from the DSLRs and even the mirrorless that we currently have. But that's what I want to persuade people on. You don't need a beautiful camera to take beautiful photos. For any beginner, this is the camera that they should be using. If they're really patient and are wanting to sit through all the pain and turbulence that comes with learning with a really manual camera, and they can afford to do so, then they can go ahead and buy those cameras. But for those that want to go ahead and just be able to take a photograph and learn on the go, but generally have a reliable piece of equipment, this is the kind of camera that you should be buying. So one of the reasons that you want a camera like this, if you're a beginner, is that it is something you're more familiar with, especially because they have inbuilt flashes, which allows you to go ahead and take photographs like that. So probably something a little bit better and nicer. But the point is, it has a flash, it's something you're able to understand quite easily and quite clearly, and it goes ahead and it just works generally. However, if you're running with an external flash, it's a whole nother thing to learn, and that's something that you have to take into account with other cameras. Whereas a camera like this, it already has it inbuilt. You're able to go ahead and photograph, and you're able to go ahead and photograph at night, and even things like gigs, which you otherwise can't do very easily with more complicated cameras. Now, one of the main reasons to buy one of these cameras, as I mentioned possibly I think earlier, was these are cheap. You can pick them up for like less than $100 New Zealand, which is like, what, 50, 70 bucks USD. The lenses are generally pretty cheap. They come with autofocusing, but you can also shoot them manually. And that's really what makes them just such a great camera, is that they're great for learners who are going from a very digital autofocus world and then coming into the more manual world, and then you're able to have the best of both. Get photos when you want to, and then also spend time learning when you want to. And that's just something that you can't generally do if you're switching straight into really heavy manual cameras. So every camera has its drawbacks, and this camera is no exception. Some cameras are great at some things, bad at other things, and that's just the way it is, even with expensive cameras. Now, the main two drawbacks of this camera is that it doesn't do multi-exposures, and I've never been able to figure a way to trick it to do so. The other thing too is that it reads as ISO, and you cannot adjust the ISO. However, there is a little button here, which is your exposure dial compensation. So if you adjust that with where you'd normally adjust your shutter, it will overexpose or underexpose, and you can look up exposure compensation to work that out. What that means is if you've got a 200 ISO film in there and you want it to act like 400, all you need to do is adjust the compensation one stop. I can't remember if it was up or down, but you can just quickly look at the manual and you'll be able to figure that one out. So I just spoke about what this camera is bad at, but I'll speak about what this camera is good at. One of the things that it's really good at is doing in long exposures. So if you want to do more than a 1 second exposure on your manual camera, you usually have to have a shutter release cable. However, with this camera, you do not have to have a shutter release cable. What that means is that it has up to 30 seconds of exposure time. And so, for example, if I had my tripod here, which I'm currently using to actually record this video, I wouldn't need to rely on always having my shutter cable around so I could go ahead and take a photograph. 30 seconds is generally more than enough exposure time to make the water reasonably quite flat here if I was wanting to go ahead and get those kinds of photos, or if I was wanting to do some kind of long exposure where I wanted to do something with the movement. Now, that being said, this camera is probably not very good for shooting astro, and one of the reasons is it only goes to 30 seconds. Yes, you can have a bulb mode, but try going ahead and finding the shutter release cable that was designed for these, which I'm not even too sure even exists, and I've never really bothered to. Now, I did mention here that this is not my very first Minolta 500 SI. They are cheap, they are made of plastic, they do break. Yeah. So if these do break, don't worry, because Minolta must have sold heaps of these, and I mean absolute truckloads, because even down at the bottom of the world where I currently live, you can find these so easily. They're always up on our equivalent to eBay. So don't worry that they are cheap, don't worry that they do break, because they're replaceable. I've had more expensive cameras, and I can tell you right now that when they do break, they are not really that replaceable or possibly even that fixable, especially if you're down at the bottom of the world. So I've gone over some of the reasons why I think this is a good camera for beginners. Now, I'll admit, maybe this video at the moment isn't the most concise, and well, that's because I'm traveling, I'm quite tired, and I probably should actually be learning to relax when I travel instead of making all these videos all the time. So how about let's wait until I get back home and I'll bring out the manual and we'll go over how to use this camera in detail and why it's a really good camera. Until then, I think I'll actually learn to relax and take a photo. Take number one. Okay, so I've made it back from my trip and my camera's still intact, and I have this. This here is the manual for the Minolta Dynex 500 SI. And I thought it'd be better to go over with the manual about why this camera is such a great camera, especially for beginners, with all the details here about the camera right here, which I will go ahead and scan this document and put it as a link in this video. Yeah, so I've gotten back home and I started doing this video and I realized that the manual that I've got here is for, I think, a slightly different model, which I've also owned, called the 505, and this is the 500. So I'm just gonna go through that manual and pretend that it's the same camera, even though there are some slight differences and variations, because you can basically pick up these cameras regardless anywhere. So let's just all pretend, okay? So with these cameras, they have an automatic built-in motor drive. So that means that you cannot go ahead and do multi-exposures. It does a single frame advance with a continuous drive up to 2 frames a second. Now this has an eye-level pentaprism field of view with a 90% magnification, 0.75 with a 50mm lens at infinity. Now these take CR2 batteries, and the great thing about CR2 batteries is that they still are sold. Now I have some other cameras out there, like an Electro Yashica, and that camera, whilst quite popular, the batteries that exist for it are no longer allowed to be made due to environmental standards that are around these days, whereas the batteries for this you can pick up and they last quite a long time. I usually only replace the batteries every 2 years. And without the batteries, this only weighs apparently 350 grams through, in my opinion, it doesn't weigh that much. Actually, it kind of weighs that much with the battery. But anyway, I think I've gone over the features for the most part about why this camera is so great. I think it's light, it's portable, it has all the functionality that you would kind of get from a digital camera. Without it being a digital camera, it's easier for those to learn. It is going to expose more correctly for you. For some people, they don't like to have wasted shots. I know when I started off shooting film, it was quite unsatisfying. And it is a costly thing to shoot film, so if you just kind of want to more get into film but not go too hard into it, then a start-off camera like this one is great. It's cheap, it's reliable, you can take it and travel with it quite easily, get used to shooting film. And then if later on you want to progress, that's when you start putting some more money into this hobby. Don't go too far into the hobby like I have, as you can see by my background, and just learn to love shooting film first and getting the most out of it. And that's why I think this should be your very first camera. So I'm back from my trip. I have this manual here and I have my camera. And as I said, I think I should sit down with this manual and go ahead and talk about this camera. So one of the things they sold these kinds of cameras on is the fact that these newer electronic cameras were able to go ahead and shoot at much higher shutter speeds, so they could stop motion like this shot here. They could shoot up to 1/1400th of a second, depending on which variant you got. They tend to have very fast shutter speeds. They can also shoot a little bit faster than the cameras that came before them with like 2 frames per second. They had a 3-point autofocus, so they were able to go ahead and focus a lot quicker than what generally an older manual camera can do, unless you're zone focusing. And they were designed to meter really fast moving subjects. They were sold so that your relatives could go ahead and take photos of their kids, and just like this photo here, just be able to go ahead, quickly track, shoot, and it generally hit its mark. In many ways, these cameras were sold as beefy point and shoots. Much more capable than your normal point and shoot, but still being a really good solid camera. And of course they were designed with portrait modes, and they had a big and bright viewfinder, which I definitely agree. The viewfinder is very big and very bright, very easy to see through. I shoot gigs with this camera and I find that to be the case. There is also the honeycomb, 14 segment honeycomb pattern metering, which as you can see by a photo like this, where there's a lot of contrast, it exposes quite well and correctly. And from my experience, I generally have a pretty good exposure hit rate with the meter that is on the camera. And if you want to know what honeycomb pattern metering is, it is light that is measured from 13 uniform segments plus the background and is integrated with the autofocus system. So that's kind of like the metering systems that exist now, where it looks at a bunch of different points and calculates an average. So as I mentioned, they have different program modes with these cameras. You've got a close-up mode for doing macro, you've got a night portrait mode, so that would have been designed for using with the flash. You've got a landscape mode, so that's where it's going to go ahead and probably look at the background and the foreground and possibly expose differently, but also focus differently. You've got a portrait mode, which will most likely focus on near subjects, and then things that are further away, it will go ahead and try to put them into the background. And then a sports action mode, it will be going ahead and looking at what's moving around and focusing on that. And you know, all of that technology was game-changing back in the day. And as someone that goes ahead and still uses this camera, I use the sports action mode, or if I want to shoot manually and just not use it. But if I'm going to go ahead and maybe shoot a gig, something like the sports action mode might actually be an advantage. And depending on the model that you have, some of them do have things like multiple exposure modes. Through the camera that I have, which is a slightly, I think, earlier version than this one, does not have the multiple exposure mode, but some of them out there do. Some of them have exposure bracketing, which my camera also has. It has the aperture and shutter priority manual modes. It has the flash, custom functions. You really don't get books like this anymore with cameras. The ones you get now are tiny little pamphlets and very boring. If we're going to bring back some 90s nostalgia in the 2020s, I would recommend bringing back booklets like this with things that we buy. But one of the great things about the Minolta series is that there are heaps of lenses out there. There was a decent wide range. You've got 35 to 70 mils, 100 to 400, which at f4.5 is pretty darn good. You've got a 2.8 fisheye, you've got a 24mm 2.8, which I think is what I've got on there. You've got telephoto lenses up to 600. You've also got tele converters as well, and you've got a couple of high-speed flashes, but you can go ahead and use other flashes. Just FYI, a lot of these cameras, they had a proprietary flash. So Sony inherited Minolta's flash mount system. It is actually a little bit different from the flash mount system that you see on a lot of other cameras. Bit of a pain in the ass, to be honest, because it's proprietary, but you can go ahead and get a converter. It might be known as a Sony converter. It's like Sony to Canon flash converter, but you just need to pop it on there and then you can go ahead and just use a standard flash that you have picked up, and it works just fine. Again, all these lenses that are on here, if you're wanting to know what they are and you have a Minolta that you want to go ahead and buy more lenses for, I'm going to go ahead and put this page and put it as a link in the video. And then what you can go ahead and do is you can look at all these lenses here, go ahead and search them on eBay, and maybe you will go ahead and find a really good deal. If I keep to my word and stop buying more cameras and lenses, I probably won't do that because I don't necessarily need anything more than what I've already got. But this is one of the ways to really increase your camera system, is to actually go out and look at what is available. And with these Minoltas, their lenses are generally pretty cheap, and there are quite a few available, so it's a great system to buy, so you can go ahead and maximize what you get for your dollar. And you can quickly buy a pretty beefy system with heaps of lenses for not too much of a price. I think I've gone over the main points of why this camera system is such a great system for beginners and why I still use it all these years later. As always, it's been real, guys. Until next time.